Welcome everyone to our speaker today. And I'm going to introduce Dr. Naomi Sugiya. We're really excited to have her present on her fascinating work. So a little bit of background here. Dr. Sugiya is an associate professor at UC Irvine's Criminology, Law, and Society Department. Her research interests include punishment and criminal justice context, employment and reentry, and social inequality. To that end, Dr. Sugiya's research examines the consequences of incarceration and other forms of criminal justice context for individuals and their families, with a particular focus on how the criminal justice system influences participation in the labor force, political system, and other governmental institutions. So she uses a wide variety of really innovative methodological approaches and has published in top journals, including but not limited to the American Journal of Sociology, Social Problems, Criminology, and elsewhere. Recently, Dr. Sugiya is working alongside other UCI faculty members and students to create a digital archive of how COVID affects those who are incarcerated. And in that project gathers personal stories. But after the talk, there will be a period for Q&A, questions and answers. So please use the Q&A feature throughout the talk on Zoom to submit questions. And at the end of the talk, I will moderate those questions. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sugiya, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you everyone for making time to join here today. I know it's a busy time period and Zoom events are hard. And so I just appreciate you all showing up and coming, and I hope we have a good discussion. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to be presenting work that is co-authored with my UC Irvine colleague, John Hipp. The title of the talk is Concentrated Disadvantage and Stress in Daily Life After Prison. And I just want to give a little bit of background about the paper before I get into the study itself. It's a paper that's based on the analysis of GPS data. And I collected these data back in 2012, 2013. It's taken a while, as you can see, to figure out how we can best use GPS location estimates in order to understand where people go throughout the day, what those places are like, and how they impact people's lives. And as you'll see, there's GPS estimates and location estimates are really exciting for so many reasons to expand our understanding of what the lived experience of places for people. But they're not like straightforward necessarily in terms of how you take those location estimates and then do something that's sociologically informed. So I hope that this will be an interesting talk for both substantive and methodological reasons. And this is a work in progress. John Hipp and I have been working on it for a while, and we're still working on it. So I really appreciate hearing your feedback and comments and ideas. So thank you. Okay, so we start off the talk by, or the study by asking, how does place matter? And here we're asking about how place matters for people who are living in urban areas of concentrated disadvantage. And there has been a huge, long line of research dedicated to this question, how does place matter for people? And I listed here just a few ways that places are thought to exacerbate or mitigate inequalities, primarily through the provision of different types of neighborhood resources, institutions and employers like firms and job opportunities and services, through the formation of more or less beneficial social networks in an area, through the organization of social relations in a place. And here I'm referring to concepts like collective efficacy in a place. And also through the presence of healthful or toxic environments. So there's a lot of research about how the physical and the social contexts, the environments of places matters for people and their individual health. Now, in terms of people who have been recently incarcerated and released, place really matters, right? And where people live, where people go, places are thought to be super important for a whole host of outcomes and for their success, for reintegration. So just to, kind of name a few things here, resources and institutions and services are thought to be too few and far away when in terms of the places that people are released to. And this is often referred to as spatial mismatch. So people have to travel long distances to access certain resources or to find jobs. And for people who are released from prison, as you all know, there's just not money, right, for transportation. And the transportation in a lot of cities is just not very good, public transportation. In addition, partly related to spatial mismatch, social networks in areas where people are released to are just thought to be less helpful for providing information about jobs, for example, but also information about other things as well. The organization of social relationships in a place is thought to be more conducive to crime and violence. So the places that people return to after release from prison are characterized by higher rates of crime and violence for a number of different reasons, but including things like the collective efficacy in an area or perceptions of police legitimacy, for example. And then finally, the physical and experienced environments are also just more toxic. They're characterized by higher levels of environmental hazards, pollution, physical disorder. They're highly policed and surveilled areas. And for people who are recently released and oftentimes on parole supervision, all of these things just really heighten the emotional stakes of spending time in these areas. In this paper, we're focusing really on one pathway that is thought to connect place with individual well-being. It's also a pathway that's just really hard to empirically study. And that's the presence of chronic stressors associated with place and how chronic stressors impact people's health. There's a lot of different theories about stress, but chronic stressors are really thought to be these enduring problems, conflicts, and threats that people experience in the course of their day-to-day lives. So they're day-to-day strains that people, experience. They're believed to accumulate over time to take a long-lasting physical and emotional and cognitive toll on people's minds and bodies. They are thought to directly impact health, but they're also thought to relate to the experience of acute stressors. So when I talk about acute stressors, I mean major life events and hardships. So chronic stressors are thought to kind of predispose people to experiencing really negative impacts of acute stressors like job loss. And in general, the stress literature is much more able to study acute stressors. They're more measurable. They're these sudden, large life events. Even though chronic stressors are really also thought to be very, very important for impacting people's lives. And in here for this project, we're really focusing on the idea of exposure to concentrated disadvantage in a place as a form of chronic stressor, even while acknowledging that in the theoretical framework, chronic stressors and acute stressors are both working together to impact people's health. So chronic stressors, like I alluded to, they're thought to take this sort of major long-lasting toll on people's health. They are believed to be the cause of population level inequalities by race, ethnicity, and by class. They are thought to result in higher rates of chronic health conditions. People who have experienced a lot of chronic stressors are more likely to experience early morbidity and mortality compared to often wealthier groups that do not experience this sort of day-to-day strains and challenges. For racial ethnic minorities in particular, chronic stressors are believed to contribute to a concept that Geronimus proposed as weathering. And I really like this concept of weathering. It's also known as premature aging. And Geronimus writes in an early paper that chronic stressors can be thought of as insults to health. So this is increased stress. It's the accumulation of exposure to environmental hazards as a product of continued residence in certain geographic areas that are, really that really take a toll on people's minds and bodies. And usually, and especially with Geronimus's research, it's really about residential place. But chronic stressors, are not necessarily always attached to residential place. They're really attached to places. And so what do I mean when I talk about chronic stressors? They're really everywhere. They can manifest from all sorts of structural, social, and environmental conditions of poor places. So we're talking about things like dilapidated housing and unsafe sidewalks, unsafe buildings, just poor playgrounds, and a lack of playgrounds, a lack of open space. We're talking about things like lack of access to fresh and healthful foods. And these things result in poor nutrition, as we know. We are also talking about things like air pollution, graffiti, and other sorts of toxic environmental hazards that are not only physically damaging, but they've also been connected to feelings of mental isolation and social isolation. I'm also talking about things like violence, perceived physical disorder, and even things that are like potentially small things like incivilities or slights that you might happen upon when you're in a place. All of these things are thought to threaten people's feelings of safety and protection. And they're connected to distress and people's feelings of stress. So as you can see, chronic stressors that are associated with place are really all around us. But empirically, these stressors, it's just difficult to identify changes in exposure to stressors, to study these things and connect them to people's health. Many of the difficulties around the methodologies to study these things is really related to our general field's focus on residential neighborhood. And I don't mean to imply that residential neighborhoods are not important, because of course they're so important. They're important for so many reasons, but they influence where we spend time, right? And how we're able to access other areas that are surrounding our residential areas. But at the same time, they're really static, right? They're kind of these measures that don't capture the range of areas that we often visit, that we might visit to go see a loved one or a family member, or that we might go to go to a job. They don't capture how our mobility patterns change over time. And they also reflect a really complicated set of selection processes about why someone lives in a certain place. And all of these things are just really challenging to adjust for statistically, to really be able to isolate that it's the place itself as opposed to some of these selection processes. So the ability to dynamically capture how people experience a place is not only important conceptually to mirror or better align with people's lived experiences of a place, But this dynamic approach is also useful methodologically because it allows us to understand how changes for a person in terms of changes of how they're exposed to more or less disadvantaged areas are related to changes in how that person feels on a day-to-day basis. And that change enables us to do within-person analyses. So in this study in particular, we're asking, are day-to-day changes in concentrated disadvantage associated with people's daily reports of negative emotions? And this dynamic kind of view of place stems from a growing emphasis on thinking about places as activity spaces. There's a recent review article that Kathleen Cagney and Erin York Cornwell and others published that I referenced here. If you're at all interested in this idea of activity spaces, I encourage you to read that paper. Activity spaces are just, it's a term for all the places that people encounter in the course of their daily lives. Sometimes there's an emphasis on the routine places that people visit in the course of their daily lives, but it's basically taking a what's called a person-centered approach to understand how places are experienced by people. So because it's the places that people experience in the course of their everyday lives, as they're going about their routines, these places are varied. They're temporally dynamic. They're not these static measures like residential place often is. And the research around activity spaces generally finds that measuring these things matters, that these places are not necessarily well aligned with where people live, especially for people who have changeable residential areas, which is like people who have been recently released from prison. Activity spaces are changeable over time. They are important for understanding, for mediating the relationship and sometimes moderating the relationship between a residential place and a person's health. So activity spaces are, an important way to think about place in people's lives. In the context of reentry from prison, the activity space idea is really, really important, I would argue. And this is really because, as you all know, from being affiliated with this center, that reentry is an unstable time period. Residential place often is not a good measure for capturing the places that people spend time in. And so activity spaces just is a better aligned concept with how place influences people's lives at reentry specifically. This dynamicism is also really important because the reentry period is a really unstable time period. It's also an emotionally challenging time period. So it's important to think about how does place influence emotional health and negative emotions, because these things are such a huge part of reentry integration. Routines are in flux, like I mentioned. Routines that span every domain, right? From finding housing to finding a job, to reconnecting with people that you haven't seen for a really long time. All of these routines are in flux. People get jobs on a day-to-day basis oftentimes, and so they're traveling to all different areas for those jobs. They also have to go to different court to access different services, and all of those things take them to different places. And we also know that after release from prison, some people have really, really large mobility patterns. They're traveling from here to there, they're going to all these different places, they're applying for dozens of jobs. And then other people who may not have the resources to do that, who may live in areas that are more limited by transportation options, or that just choose to stay more, local to their residential place, that they are often spatially isolated. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of people's experiences in their spatial mobility after release from prison. And the final thing I'll say, and I know you all know so much of this already, so I won't spend too much time on it, but just that reentry, even though it's such a unique period of time in people's lives, it is a common period of time in so many people's lives as a result of mass incarceration, the expansion of the carceral state over the last several decades, and the unequal expansion of the carceral state to certain groups and communities, like people who are lower income, less skilled, and who are racial ethnic minorities. And so, this experience, this unstable experience, because of the inequities and how that is experienced across the population, is just a really important period to think about, and how it influences other inequities later on. Okay, so, I've talked about the concept of activity spaces. Activity spaces as a concept forwards this dynamic, varied framework. It seems really attractive and straightforward, but in practice, measuring activity spaces oftentimes the measures do not align with the spirit of the concept. There is a distance between how we operationalize this and how we think about this. So I just listed here a few different common ways that people measure activity spaces in the field. And so activity spaces are often measured based on survey questions, like in LA Fans. These are important questions because they're really not asked in many other places at all. So it's an important source of data, but they're also asked at a single point in time about someone's routinely visited places. So they ask, where's your job located? Where do you routinely go to church? Where's your doctor's office located? Where do you routinely grocery shop? Those sorts of things. Other measures take some individual location points that maybe were collected when someone filled out a phone survey, or when someone was on their Twitter account or something like that, and aggregates those points up to an area. And so this is another static measure. And then finally, one of the most common ways of measuring activity spaces is with the standard deviational ellipse, which I'm showing here in the graphic. And that's the idea that you draw an outer boundary or a circle around the points that someone visited. So this is showing in green the locations that people visited. And then you draw an outer boundary among those, most or all of those points. And this results in a single sort of circular region, which is the person's activity space. Again, it's often not dynamic, not changeable over time. It's really this one single circle. The other thing that can be very problematic about this approach is that it includes the places people visited in green, and it includes places they didn't visit, as you can see. But the idea is, if we think about distance as the only limiting factor, they could have visited those areas. When sociologists are trying to use this to study sociological questions, that really becomes problematic, as you might imagine, because there's all sorts of reasons that are not about distance, geographic distance, that stop someone from entering a certain area. And, there's laws, there's exclusions, but there's also like socially constructed acceptable and unacceptable places, right? So there's all these things that really challenge this idea that you can include all the locations within this ellipse. So in this paper, what we're trying to do is measure activity spaces through a slightly different approach. We're calling it egocentric places, but it's really about how do we capture those green locations, those green circles, as opposed to that broader outer circle. How do we really focus in on those specific location areas? And this, it's, sometimes I call this a new-ish idea, because I don't really want to say it's a new idea, because there's a long line of people who have proposed similar types of things. My co-author, John Hipp, proposed the idea of an ego hood method for residential neighborhoods, which is the same idea of what we're basically doing is just narrowing in on a certain place and drawing a small outer boundary or buffer around this central point. And so that idea that you draw a small buffer, in this case, we do a 1/4 mile, so it's a walkable distance, that you draw it around some central location point, that is pretty much taking from the ego hood method that John Hipp developed. It's also very much in line with a lot of the ideas of the egocentric local environment method that also was proposed for understanding a person's residential place. And so here, all we're doing, I don't want to make it overly complicated. It's just to say that we are taking some single important location points, drawing a 1/4 mile buffer around those points, and then aggregating up census block data to understand the characteristics of those places. And this allows us to really focus in on the characteristics of these particular places that people visit throughout their day-to-day lives. I am going to talk a little bit more about how we do that, like how we take GPS estimates and get to that place with the activity spaces. But first, I want to describe the data a little bit so you know what we're working with. So we analyzed GPS location estimates and daily reports of emotions that were collected from the Newark Smartphone Reentry Project. This is the project I alluded to that I did back in 2012, 2013. It was actually my dissertation. And the way I sampled people is I sampled them from a census of all people who were all men who were recently released from prison and on parole supervision in Newark, New Jersey. People were eligible to be approached for this study if they were neither gang identified nor convicted of a sex offense, if they planned to search for work, and if they were proficient in English. And a lot of these criteria just reflect the administrative policies of how people are supervised in Newark. And people who are gang identified, for example, are supervised in a different part of the office. So it was really more about trying to do something that was feasible and working with one section of the parole office. Of the 152 people that were identified as eligible for the study during this time and were contacted, 135 people, or about 89%, agreed to participate. So it was a pretty high participation rate for people who were just recently released from prison. In this paper, we focused on the 129 people who had multiple observations for both their GPS estimates as well as daily reports of their emotions at the end of the day. And I'll talk a little bit about those measures after I describe the project design a bit more. So participants completed an initial interview. They were followed for 3 months, and then they completed an exit interview. And 70% of the initial participants completed all 3 of these phases. Among the people who didn't complete all 3, a lot of people completed the 3-month study period. So that period was still pretty long. It was actually on average over 9 weeks. The 3-month study period, where people were contributing information via their phones. And so the project overall collected a lot of different types of data, some of which I've published on in the past. And for the purposes, so I list those things here. And for the purposes of the study, the paper today, we're really focusing on reports in the daily survey that people filled out every day at 7 p.m. And we're focusing on the GPS location estimates that were passively collected from people's phones every 15 minutes during daytime hours. So the key measures we're considering here, for our dependent variable, we're looking at daily emotions. We consider a negative affect measure, which is the average of 3 questions that people were asked about how sad they felt today, how stressed they felt today, and how angry they felt today. And they reported their answers by moving a bar on their phone, on their touchscreen phones, from 0, which meant not at all, to 100, which meant very. And then the other primary measure that we're looking at here is exposure to daily concentrated disadvantage. And here we have 2 main measures. We have a between person measure, which is basically just the average amount of exposure to concentrated disadvantage for the person throughout the 3 months based on their GPS estimates. And then a within person measure, which is day-to-day changes from their average on a day-to-day basis over these 3 months. Now, to create those daily measures of concentrated disadvantage, we had a 3-step process to take the GPS estimates and then to get them to a place where we could have these person day averages of concentrated disadvantage for that day. So I'm going to walk you through this, and this is really for illustrative purposes, so you understand kind of how we're doing this with the GPS estimates. Okay, so first of all, we have each of these dots are supposed to be GPS locations. We first try to distinguish between locations that reflect movement and those that reflect staying in an area, spending time in an area. Ultimately, we think that the way that this impacts stress and negative emotions is by exposure to places of disadvantage and all of the chronic stressors that are related to that place. And because of that, we want to identify places that people are in, where they're spending time in those places, as opposed to driving through a place, for example. So we focus on the places where people are staying relatively still, as opposed to moving. And then for each of those clusters of places, we identify the central location point in that cluster. And this is illustrated by the red dots. So for that cluster, we're finding that center point. And then using that center point, we draw our quarter-mile buffer around that central point. And then we take census block information and we aggregate it to that quarter-mile circle. Quarter-mile buffer circle. And that provides us with areas that have varying levels of concentrated disadvantage. Now, if you are interested in the specific places that people are going and the characteristics of those places, then you could really stop here and you could look at the different places, and the characteristics. But because we're interested in how daily levels of exposure are related to daily reports of emotions, we then aggregate up all of the characteristics of all these places for that day in a person's life, and we weight those characteristics by how much time they spent there throughout the day, and then we come up with a daily average of disadvantage, exposure to disadvantage. So I hope that was a helpful illustration. I know it's a little bit in the weeds. So before I get to the findings about how exposure to concentrated disadvantage is related to people's reports of emotions, I want to show you a little bit about the sample, first of all. So we have I broke this out into person day observations, which are daily measures for each person, and then person level observation. So you know more about the characteristics of the people in the sample. So looking at the negative affect, sad, stressed, and angry measures, you can see that the average level of negative affect on the 100-point scale over all people and days is 23. Feeling sad is 20, stressed 29, angry 20. So this is on a 100-point scale, averaged across all people and all days in the 3-month period. The concentrated disadvantage mean is 8.82. So what does that mean? So that means that based on those daily measures of exposure to concentrated disadvantage, the average level is about 8.82 or about 9 percentage points higher than the average level of concentrated disadvantage throughout all of New Jersey. So our baseline here is New Jersey, and this is 8.82 percentage points above the average of all of New Jersey. If you compare it to this concentrated disadvantage based on residential place down here, you can see that it is very slightly actually lower than where people live. The weekend versus weekday distinction is about what you would expect, suggesting that there's not a bias towards filling out the surveys on weekends versus weekdays. And then here there's some demographics and educational attainment and other sort of measures about the sample overall. And I'll just say that the average age was 36. Over 90% of the sample self-identify as non-Hispanic Black. Almost 3/4 is either a high school graduate, which includes GED or less. And almost half reported that they were single. I'll say that almost half also reported that they have a romantic partner, and a small percentage of people were married. So that table provided the average across all people and all days. But the strength of our data are that you can really dig into temporal changes and you can dig into person level variation. So this next figure tries to do some of that. So in this is showing levels of negative affect on the y-axis. It's over 90 days on the x-axis. And it's reported for the sample overall in red, and then for 4 people. So how do we pick these people? These people are randomly chosen based on the quartiles of disadvantage where they live. So person 1 was randomly selected from the people in the sample who were living in the lowest quartile of concentrated disadvantage. Person 4 was picked from among the respondents who were living in the highest quartile of concentrated disadvantage. And so I don't want you to spend too much time thinking about each of the people, because they're just, it's just 4 people. But what I wanted to show you is how much variation there really is in people's reports over time within a person. And then here you can see, let's see, oops. Okay, it's broken down for sadness, stress, and anger. And so you can see that for these people, there's a lot of correspondence across these 3 measures of sadness, stress, and anger, but there's also some differences, right? And you can see from the sample, the red line, that these things are modestly increasing over the 90 days. People are feeling less good over this 90-day period on average, but that really depends on the person, because you can see that it's hard to see that increasing slope when you're just looking at a specific person's reports. Now we do the same thing, but with concentrated disadvantage. So this is reporting what the level of exposure to concentrated disadvantage is over the 90-day period. It's for the sample overall, on average, over these 90 days, and then for each of these 4 people, the same 4 people as before. What's also really neat about this is we can also compare their exposure to disadvantage based on the GPS estimates, which are in red or yellow, green, blue, to the exposure to disadvantage based on residential place, which is in navy here. So you can see that there is this slight pattern, where just modestly people are experiencing places that are slightly lower in disadvantage than where they live, if you look at the sample overall. But you can see based on the people's reports that this is actually this relationship is different depending on the person. Okay, so here we get into the models, the statistical models. And in order to examine the relationship between daily emotions and daily levels and changes of concentrated disadvantage, we are estimating multi-level models. They include random effects for between subjects and within subjects. And for presentation purposes, I'm displaying the results for the main independent variables of interest related to concentrated disadvantage. But the controls listed under the table are also in these models. Okay, so the one we're really interested in here is actually this person day deviation. And what this refers to is for the person controlling for their average level of disadvantage, how do daily deviations, increases or decreases, how does that correspond to their daily reports of emotions? And so first you can see here that there is a positive but marginally significant relationship of 0.21 between increases for that day in disadvantage to negative affect. When we look specifically at the 3 measures, you can see that even though there's positive associations throughout all 3, it's really being driven much by this relationship between stress, feeling stressed and reporting stress, and the deviation and disadvantage for that day. Now, another way to look at the results in this table, which I really love, is these spaghetti plots. And so what's nice about spaghetti plots, which are simply fitted regression lines for each person. So each of these lines represents a person's estimated relationship fitted line between concentrated disadvantage and negative affect, sadness, stress, or anger. And what's great about spaghetti plots is that you're able to see the real variation between people in terms of the relationship, so the slope of the line, and also the level that they're reporting. You can see some people are reporting really high levels of feeling sad, stressed, or angry, and a lot of people are reporting much lower levels. You can even see that for some people, like if we look at the stress panel, the average person, as shown in the navy, has this increasing slope, which we saw on the table, the increasing relationship between disadvantage and feeling stressed. But you can see that even though this is the average, there are some people who have a very different relationship between disadvantage and stress. And it's actually negative and sharply negative in the opposite direction, which implies that for some people, they're reporting less stress as they're in as they're in areas with higher levels of disadvantage. So this is a really nice way of seeing how the sample averages and that average association relates to all this other sample heterogeneity. Okay, what we also did was we separated out the sample between those who live in areas of lower disadvantage and those who live in areas of higher disadvantage. And so we just cut the sample in half. And so half of the sample who lives in areas by residential place of lower disadvantage are on the left. Those who live in higher disadvantage are on the right. And what's interesting here is that, like, for instance, if you look at the stress, the outcome of stress, we see that increasing relationship, but it's really only measurable among people who already live in areas of higher disadvantage. And that relationship, this increasing slope, this increasing positive relationship between disadvantage and feeling stressed, is not the same as the relationship between disadvantage and feeling sad and disadvantage and feeling angry. And for those two emotions, the relationship is flat. It's pretty much zero. And so even though on average, people who live in higher levels of disadvantage are reporting higher levels of feeling anger and sadness, it's not impacted in the same way that stress is when you change the day-to-day levels of concentrated disadvantage. So those are our main findings. To summarize, we find that daily changes in concentrated disadvantage are related to daily changes in negative emotions, specifically stress. It's a modest association. I didn't get into the magnitude in the prior slides, but basically this is a small association. So we can think of it where a 1 standard deviation increase in daily disadvantage is associated with a 0.05 standard deviation increase in stress on average. If you look at people who are already living in relatively more disadvantaged areas, it's about 0.07 of a standard deviation. So this is small. It's not a big relationship. But our thinking about this is that it's a realistic relationship, and it's still important. People's reports of feeling stressed at the end of the day, those reports are influenced by all sorts of factors, as you might imagine. Where you are and the experience, of being in a place or being in places throughout the day has an effect, but a small one compared to all the other things that is going on in your life as well. So we think our interpretation of this modest association is that it makes sense, and it's still important because the way that we think about chronic stressors are that these are the day-to-day strains. These are the insults to health. They're small things, but over time, over people's lives, right? Their experiences, they can have an impact. And then the second point is just talking about that really a lot of the relationship is concentrated among people who are already living in areas with relatively higher levels of disadvantage. And then I also wanted to just point out that for some people, the associations between disadvantage and stress are really in the opposite direction. Like I pointed out with the spaghetti pots, where increasing disadvantage is actually related to decreasing stress. And we speculate on some of the reasons for this. And those speculations are primarily around people's perceptions of access to more advantaged places, people feeling like they don't belong, people feeling uncomfortable, all these things that make places more or less accessible to people can also have an impact on how they feel, after being in those places. And so that's some of our speculations for that. I'll end by talking about kind of taking a step back from the specific examples of reentry, disadvantage, and stress to say that, activity spaces are really this exciting, promising conceptual idea and framework for understanding the lived experience of place in people's lives. And activity spaces has been this exciting concept for the last 20 years or so, right? That it's been around. But the measures that we have for measuring activity spaces just are, they're trying to keep up with the excitement of the concept. And we still have a ways to go to really align how we measure activity spaces with how we think about activity spaces. We propose this egocentric approach as one of many different approaches to measure activity spaces. We think there are some strengths to it. I just put here a few questions that you could answer using this sort of specific approach. But the point is that this area, especially tech-informed data, is just rapidly changing over time. And we need to, as researchers, continue to create new ways of analyzing these data and really trying to make the most of these new exciting types of data for how we think the world works. So I'll end there, and just thanks for coming, thanks for listening, and happy to take any questions or comments that you might have.
Thank you so much, Naomi. That was really interesting. Just a reminder to everyone, you can submit your questions to the Q&A feature, so please do that, and I will moderate the questions. So far, we don't have any in yet, but I'm assuming people will be submitting them. I have a question. I think this is really fascinating to think about, and it's complicated for many of the reasons you point out in terms of measuring these kinds of things. And so one of my thoughts is, well, I have two questions, but the first one is about how stigma can matter for maybe mediating one's negative emotions or stress, right? So you talked about how potentially sometimes people, when they go into environments that have increased disadvantage, they actually experience lower stress. So I could imagine that different places, potentially the stigma attached to being formerly incarcerated or having criminal, or the how many people have criminal records in that area maybe can affect the amount of stigma one can perceive they receive for, right, for having being formerly incarcerated in this case. So it's hard to measure stigma, of course, but I was wondering if you have thoughts about how stigma might either mediate or factor into one's kind of negative emotions, as it can vary either day to day even, or by context.
Yeah, that's such a great question and comment. And I definitely think stigma is playing a role in terms of, what you talked about, outward kind of classifications or perceptions, and also like how that triggers internal like feelings about identity, right? And so, yeah, it's definitely, I think there's a lot of reasons in the broader social stigma literature that even exists outside of criminal records specifically, why we would expect, though, that criminal records would be such a salient mediator for these sorts of processes. And I, it would be so, one thing with this focus on the characteristics of concentrated disadvantage, it's one type of characteristic of a place. But as you raised, you might think that if they were going to a place to apply for a job, for example, and maybe that place would take them outside of their norm, they would be going to a different area. There's all sorts of uncertainties. They're feeling the stigma of their record because there's so much wrapped up in applying for a job, and it raises all these feelings about the record and the stigma, that those sorts of contexts and experiences based on events, right, applying for a job, would be really, really heightened and really, really important. And so we're focused on concentrated disadvantage, but it's just one tiny characteristic of a place where if we could get at some of these other things more specifically, that would be really, really exciting and important to do.
I do have a question that came in, and someone asked about being curious about what the study would look like only with Latinx and African American participants versus white counterparts. I know the majority were African American, I believe, if that was correct. But in other words, is there any variation according to race in your findings?
Yeah, so in our findings specifically, no, just because over 90% of our already small sample did self-identify as non-Hispanic Black. But I think that if anyone were to do a future study like this, that would be the direction I would go in, right? Is to try to understand how these things work with a more racially and ethnically diverse sample. And part of the racial composition of our sample in Newark is really just a reflection of the very large racial inequalities and who is incarcerated and released on parole, especially in Newark, New Jersey. But I think that when we think about stigma and some of these other processes that I mentioned, race and ethnicity, are hugely visible indicators that can really make people feel like they do or do not belong in an area. And so, I think that would be very, very important in terms of, and then you wouldn't look at concentrated disadvantage necessarily as your key indicator, like predictor of a place. Maybe you would look at racial ethnic composition of a place, the diversity of that place, and whether someone, given those levels of diversity, whether someone would feel comfortable just even having even their presence, right, in that physical location. I know that as an Asian American, I definitely, that is something that's on my mind when I enter into certain places or not.
Okay, so another question is, do you believe the better integration programs could help alleviate some of these emotional feelings?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that a lot of what we're hypothesizing is going on here, and a lot of what the findings support are really about processes that are structural, right? And so they're about the places, like all of the inequities and the challenges of places that are under-resourced. And so I could imagine being, I think our findings sort of point to the importance of those structures and the places themselves, thinking about place, really just daily exposure to place, not where you live, but just the daily exposure as being important to consider in people's health and well-being. And so structural changes to those places, making improvements to those places, is not just helping the residents of those areas, it's helping all the people who frequent and spend time in those areas. And so that's where I would see the interventions being the most promising, or the services. I think that obviously services for people and to support people's emotional health, especially at reentry, is important. But I think that ultimately the processes that are going on here are structural, and those things need to be considered. It's not just interventions for individuals, I guess.
Okay, another question. Were the men recently paroled? If so, the first 3 months of release into even a concentrated disadvantage may be considered better than their former places of incarceration. That being said, as time passes, such as after 1 year, and the men become more integrated back into their respective communities, might the results be more significant with regard to stress level within groups?
Yeah, so I hope I understand the full intent of the question. I'll first say that yes, people started their participation in the study soon after they were released from prison. They were all on parole supervision at the beginning. Some of them actually ended supervision halfway through our study, but at the beginning of the study, they were all very recently released from prison. And just usually it was like the first or second or third meeting with parole where we told them about the study. And I totally 100% agree that the first 3 months is really different from the first year, and that's different from the first 2 years. And I think that being able to do this sort of analysis with samples at different time periods, different people, different contexts would be really, really important to do. This is a pretty specific sample at a pretty specific time period. And I would be so interested to know and to see how our findings are different given these scope conditions and these things that are specific to the time period and the people and the neighborhoods, as related to even the same group of people, but 1 year out as opposed to 3 months out. Because I agree, 3 months is it's like I said at the beginning, it's a unique period of time. It's in so many ways, it's really unstable in so many ways, which is partly makes it a good time period to use these sorts of methods and to think about these sorts of methods to capture this sort of instability. But it is very different even from like a year out.
Okay, next question. The terms sadness, anger, and stress may subjectively mean different things to different people. Did the study design include any efforts to standardize the definitions of those emotions before the participants provided their subjective observations?
Yeah, great question. So there was a sample. So in the before the initial interview that everyone did, there was a sample survey that we walked through with everyone individually and talked through the different key questions. So this set of questions in particular were questions that were repeated, as you could see, every day. So these questions were some of the key questions that we walked through on that sample survey. But you're 100% right that even setting that aside, everyone has a different perception of what it means to be not at all stressed versus very stressed, what it means to put your indicator bar at 50 versus 75 versus 25, right? Like that means different things to everyone, which is why in the analysis, it was really important to adjust for the average for each person. So that's why we have in the models, we have 2 measures of concentrated disadvantage based on GPS. One is the average overall. So if someone's just more likely to just, put 75 all the time as opposed to 25, like that helps to adjust for that person's just general inclination to put a higher level than someone else who might be feeling similarly but is putting a lower level on their scale. And so that's why we really try to focus on the measure of within person change. So adjusting and accounting for the fact that a person is more likely to put a higher number, how does their deviation from that average on a day-to-day basis influence I was talking about concentrated disadvantage. I think I got it mixed up in my head for a second there. I apologize. I hope that wasn't too confusing. But yeah, we can do the same sorts of things, and we have done the same sorts of things with emotions by earmarking emotions on a person average and then doing the deviation that way. Sorry about that. I hope that wasn't too confusing for you.
Okay. Justice involved citizens may not be able to get government assistance with financial programs, but are there any policies that we could implement or reform that can better support these people?
Yes. So, well, first of all, we can definitely, I shouldn't say definitely, we can, there's the potential to reform what you just mentioned, which is that people can, there's ongoing efforts to remove bans placed on people to be able to, for them to access social services and welfare specifically, and food stamps. And so I think the first part of, can you repeat the first part of the question actually, Sharon? Sorry.
So it's, hold on, sorry. I gotta pull it up here.
Oh, okay.
Justice involves citizens may not be able to get government assistance with financial programs, but are there any policies we can implement or reform that can better support them?
Okay, yeah, I just want to make sure I was understanding the question, unlike that last one. So what I want to say is that there are ongoing efforts to remove bans, existing bans of that prevent people from getting access to social services like food stamps, cash assistance, general assistance, housing support, all of these things that were banned under federal legislation with Clinton actually in 1996. There's lots of states have at this point opted out of that, including California. And so I think I think actually a large part of my research does look at these bans for these services. And I do think that that is the way that we can try to, if we can open up these programs to people with criminal records, who have drug-related criminal records, and stop banning them for their lifetimes based on one conviction that happened maybe 20 years ago. I think that's the way that we can really support people in a way that is inclusive and universalistic. And so I think that's really important to do. And California has removed a lot of the restrictions, but they also don't really advertise that they've done that. So I think, and there's so much variation from state to state. Like half of the states still ban people from accessing cash assistance for their lifetimes, for example. So I think that there's a real opportunity there to just continue to remove those sorts of barriers across states, and because there's no reason why a person, I think there's no reason why a person who was convicted of a drug-related offense so many years ago should be excluded for their lifetimes from something like food stamps. And so I think those sorts of supports are really important. And I think that we also, more specifically for reentry, as I'm sure many of you know, the reentry landscape has a lot of money invested in it, but the way that that system is set up in terms of government contracts and bidding, it's like all of these organizations are just trying to outbid each other to be the lowest bidder. And that just results, even though this area is relatively well funded, like if you look at the aggregate amounts of federal support, like if you look at a typical reentry organization, they are really, really struggling. They don't pay their staff well. They have tons of staff turnover. Like these organizations are struggling. And so if we were to really change the way that we allot contracts to organizations to try to prevent this bidding to giving the contract to the lowest bidder, I think we could really improve the quality of the existing reentry resources that we currently are providing, but they're just not high quality because of these like larger structural issues.
Okay, were any individuals released on parole with an ankle monitor? If so, did the monitor add higher levels of negative emotions and stress?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know of anybody in our study who was wearing an ankle monitor, but that doesn't mean that they weren't, because we really, even though we recruited people from parole through that first or second or third meeting, we didn't share any information with parole, and that goes both ways. So I don't know what the level of supervision or the requirements of supervision was for the people on our study. And parole didn't know even if the person was in our study or not. So I actually don't know if certain people had ankle monitors.
Okay, I know we're almost out of time, so one last question, and this was something I was thinking about. So in terms of kind of the broader implications of the study, I think you make a pretty convincing case here that concentrated disadvantage and fluctuations of that can have really negative consequences on people's stress and negative emotions. So thinking how that matters in the long term, do you have any idea about how that, and maybe this is something you're working on, but how that has long-term consequences in terms of affecting recidivism rates or other types of, like, if someone's so stressed out and overwhelmed, maybe they think forget it, maybe I'll just engage in something, some behavior that, and then they end up getting rearrested. So have you kind of thought about that?
Yeah, so I have thought about going back and getting, so we do have recidivism information for several years out from the study, from initial participation in the study. We haven't looked at how stress in particular is related to recidivism rates, but it's something we could do. I think that what I would be most interested, and I also think an area that we wish we could have gone into was to really understand cumulative impact of stress exposure to negative emotions. I think the 3-month period is just not long enough to really understand cumulative. Chronic stressors are important in the research and in the theory because of the cumulative nature of those stressors. And we're not really able to do that, I think, with the 3-month period. But what I'm really interested in, and I haven't had a chance to do it yet, is to look at those people who report really high levels of stress. I think you saw in the spaghetti plots, there are some people, so the vast majority, or not vast majority, but the majority of people are reporting pretty low levels of stress on that scale. But there's a group of people who are reporting really high levels of stress continuously throughout the 3-month period. They're always stressed. Maybe they have a dip once in a while, but they're pretty much always stressed out. And to be able to really just look at that subgroup of people and try to figure out what's going on in their lives, I think would be very useful and important. And I think we have the data to do that. It's just a matter of doing it, because one thing that I didn't mention we do, which actually has given us a lot of confidence with this paper's findings, is that every day we also ask people to report a high point of the day and a low point of the day. And that was an open-ended question, and people could just say whatever was a really great part of the day and a really stressful or bumming part of the day. And those reports are really, really illuminating, because they point to all the health issues that actually people are struggling with themselves and the health issues of their family members. A lot of them are caretakers of their parents, for example. A lot of them report violence. There's a number of people who report having someone close to them pass away. There's just a lot of violence and death, actually, and health issues that people are reporting in these open-ended questions. And obviously, those things would be so stressful on a person who is also trying to reintegrate and re-enter and comply with parole requirements. So I wish we could look at that group of people specifically.
Okay, well, we are out of time now, but I want to thank you so much, Naomi, for coming. I think your talk was really interesting. We had a good attendance, and many of my students from my criminology course are here, so I was happy to see that. So thanks again so much, and I'll talk to you some other time soon.
Thanks for having me. Thank you for coming, everyone, and feel free to reach out.